The woman at the front desk of the visitor center was named Yvette, according to her name tag, and she had the kind of practiced patience that told me she had been asked variations of my question all summer. I had walked up to the counter with a folded map in my hand, and I had said without preamble that I was looking for the trail my sister had walked 11 years ago. Yvette did not react. She did not ask which sister. She did not ask what year. She said, "There are a few trails people ask about. Do you have a name for it, or should I show you the map?" I said I had a name. I said the name. Yvette's face did not change, but her hand, which had been resting on the counter beside a small tray of pinback buttons shaped like pine cones, moved. It moved perhaps 2 inches from the tray to the edge of the counter, and then it did not move again. She said, "That trail is still open. It's on the northeast side of the district. I can mark it for you." I said I would appreciate that. I gave her my map. She unfolded it on the counter and drew a small circle in green pencil around a segment of trail near the northern ridge. Her pencil was very sharp. The circle was very neat. She refolded the map along its original creases and handed it back to me without looking up. She said, "It's a nice walk. Do you have water?" I said I did. She said, "Do you have someone expecting you back by a particular time?" I said no. I said I was staying at the lodge by myself. I said I had come for the week. Yvette looked up then. She looked at me the way a person looks at another person when they are deciding whether to say a thing they are not supposed to say. Then she looked back down at the tray of pinecone buttons. She said, "The lodge staff does a room check at 10 every evening. If you're not back by then, they'll come find you. That's the arrangement." She said it in a tone that was neither a warning nor a reassurance. It was a piece of operational information, delivered flatly, in the way a person delivers a piece of operational information when they have decided that delivering it is the most they are willing to do. I said thank you. I said I would be back before 10. I walked out of the visitor center into a bright, cold morning in the second week of September, and I began the drive to the northeast trailhead. My sister's name was Wenna. She was 3 years older than me. She disappeared from this park 11 years ago in the 3rd week of August, along with a man she had been dating for about a year and a half. His name was Paul. They'd come to the park for a long weekend. They had checked into the lodge on a Friday afternoon. They had eaten dinner in the lodge dining room that evening and had spoken briefly with a couple at the adjacent table, who later remembered them as cheerful and unremarkable. On Saturday morning, they had signed the trail register at the northeast trailhead at 8:14 a.m. They had not signed out. The search operation began on Sunday afternoon, when the lodge staff noticed their car still in the parking lot and their room untouched since Saturday morning's housekeeping. The search lasted 11 days. It involved, at its peak, 42 personnel, 3 helicopters, 4 dog teams, and volunteers from 3 adjacent counties. The search grid covered approximately 80 square miles of terrain, radiating outward from the trailhead and the trail itself. Nothing was found. Not a boot print, not a scrap of fabric, not a piece of trash, not a shed hair on a branch, no indication that they had left the trail, no indication that they had stayed on it. No indication that they had been present in the park at all after the moment they signed the register. On the 11th day, the search was suspended. On the 28th day, it was formally terminated. 7 years later, at my mother's request, they were declared dead in absentia by a probate judge in the county where they had both lived. That was 4 years before this trip. My mother died 2 years after the declaration. The house had gone to me because I was the only one left. I had come to the park this week to decide whether to sell it. I did not know why I thought coming to the park would help me decide. I knew only that I had woken up one morning in July, in the small apartment I had moved into after my mother died, and I had understood that I could not decide about the house from inside the house. I had to go somewhere else and think. I had chosen the park because it was where the last thing had happened. It was not a good reason. It was the reason I had. The drive to the northeast trailhead took 40 minutes on a paved road that turned, in its last 3 miles, to well-graded gravel. I passed one other vehicle, a Park Service pickup driven by a man in a green uniform who raised one finger from the steering wheel in the small salute rural drivers use to acknowledge one another. I raised mine back. In my rearview mirror I saw him slow, watch me continue up the road, and then resume his own drive in the direction he had been going. The trailhead was a small gravel lot with room for perhaps a dozen vehicles. On the morning I arrived, there were 3 cars in it: a dusty station wagon with a bicycle rack, a newer SUV with a rental agency sticker on the rear window, a hatchback with a bumper sticker for a college in another state. I parked at the far end of the lot, near the trailhead sign, and I sat in the car for a while before I got out. The sign was a standard Park Service sign, brown with routed yellow lettering. It listed the name of the trail and its length 6.4 miles round trip, out and back to a small lake, and its difficulty rating moderate. Beneath those it listed the standard warnings. Bring water. Tell someone your plans. Stay on the trail. Do not approach wildlife. Below the wildlife warning was a small paragraph in smaller type. It read, "This trail passes through active wildlife habitat. Sightings of protected species have been reported in this area. Visitors are asked to remain on marked trails and to report all wildlife encounters at the visitor center or by radio." I had read that paragraph, or paragraphs very like it, on trail signs my whole adult life. I had never before read one and paused. I paused now, not because of the words, because of the small metal plate riveted to the bottom of the sign below the paragraph, which read Habitat Zone 4-N in stamped lettering. I did not know what Habitat Zone 4-N was. I had grown up in a family that took trails seriously. My father had been a birder. My mother had kept a field guide by the back door for 50 years. I had walked in national parks and state forests and wilderness areas on 3 continents. I had never seen a habitat zone number on a trail sign. I signed the trail register. I wrote my name, my starting time, my intended turnaround point, the lake, and my expected return time, mid-afternoon. I did not write the name of a person I was traveling with, because I was not traveling with a person. In the column for emergency contact, I wrote the name of a friend and her phone number. I closed the register. The pen was on a string, and the string was tied to a nail with a knot my sister had probably not tied, because the register book must have been replaced dozens of times in 11 years. But I looked at the knot anyway. Then I started walking. The trail climbed gently for the first mile through a forest of tall firs. The ground was soft with needles. The light came down in shafts. It was, in the practical sense of the words, a nice walk. The temperature was in the low 50s, and the air smelled of wet bark and something sweeter underneath it that I could not name. I passed the first mile marker at what my watch told me was a normal pace for a person of my age and fitness carrying a small day pack. At the 1.5 mile point, I began to notice the birds. I want to describe this carefully, because I am not a birder, and I do not want to overstate what I saw. What I noticed was not a specific species. It was an absence. The forest I had walked into at the trailhead had been full of ordinary morning sounds, chickadees, a nuthatch, some kind of small brown finch flitting between the low branches. Those sounds had continued through the first mile. Somewhere between the first mile marker and the 1.5 mile point, they had stopped. I stopped too, when I noticed. I stood on the trail and listened. There was wind in the tops of the firs. There was the sound of a small stream somewhere off to the left, out of sight. There was nothing else. I told myself that this was ordinary. I told myself that patches of forest often go quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with anything a hawk passing overhead, a change in the ground cover, a shift in the wind. I began walking again. The silence continued for perhaps another 1/2 mile. Then at what I estimated to be the 2-mile point, it ended, not gradually, all at once. I took a step, and the forest was quiet, and I took another step, and there were birds, again the same chickadees, the same nuthatch, the same small brown finches, at what sounded like the same density and the same distance from the trail as they had been before the silence started, as though I had walked through a room in which the birds were not, and out of it into a room in which they were. I stopped again. I turned around and walked back the way I had come. 20 feet, 30 feet, 40. At approximately 50 feet, the birds stopped. I stood in the silence for a full minute. Then I walked forward, back towards the lake, and at approximately the same point, the birds resumed. I did this 3 times. The boundary held. It was not sharp in the sense of a line drawn on the ground. I could not have marked it with a stake, but it was a real transition, and it occurred in approximately the same section of trail each time I walked through it. The section was perhaps 100 yards long. Inside it, the forest was quiet. Outside it, the forest was ordinary. I stood on the trail at the far end of the quiet section for a long time. I did not know what I was looking at. I did not think it was anything. I thought it might be a very local difference in vegetation, or a difference in soil temperature, or a subtle depression in the topography that channeled sound in a way I could not perceive. I am not a naturalist. I have no professional standing to interpret a forest. What I had was a lifetime of walks with my father, who would have known what to say about the quiet, and who was not alive to say it. I looked at my watch. I'd been walking for a little over an hour. The lake was another 1.25 miles ahead. I decided to continue. At approximately the 3-mile mark, I came to a small clearing on the north side of the trail. The clearing was perhaps 40 feet across, roughly circular, and it opened out into a view of a low ridge to the north with a scree slope running down toward a creek. There was a wooden bench at the clearing's edge, the kind of bench park services install at scenic points. The bench had a small brass plaque set into the top of its backrest. The plaque was tarnished. I sat on the bench and read the plaque. In memory of Thomas Elvig, who loved these woods, 1938 to 1994. I sat with the plaque for a while. Then I looked out at the ridge. There was a woman on the scree slope. She was perhaps 200 yards away, downslope and to the northwest, walking slowly across the scree in the direction of the creek. She was wearing a red jacket. She had dark hair, pulled back. She was carrying what looked like a small day pack over one shoulder. She was walking with a slight favoring of her left leg, the kind of favoring a person develops after a knee injury that has healed imperfectly. I watched her for perhaps 30 seconds. She did not look up at me. She did not appear to know I was there. She was picking her way carefully across the loose stone, in the manner of a person who had been on scree before, and who understood how to move on it. My sister had favored her left leg. She had torn a meniscus playing soccer in college, and had never had it properly repaired. She had walked, for the rest of her life, with a small hitch on that side that was invisible to anyone who did not know her, and immediately recognizable to anyone who did. I stood up from the bench. I put my hand on the bench's backrest to steady myself. I watched the woman continue across the scree. She was moving in the direction of a stand of trees at the base of the slope. She reached the trees. She stopped for a moment, adjusting the strap of her pack. She turned her head slightly, not enough to look up at the clearing, but enough that I could see the line of her jaw and the shape of her ear. The shape of the ear was not my sister's. I want to be clear about this, because in the moment I was not clear about it, and in the hours afterward I was less clear. And it is only now, writing this some months later, that I have permitted myself to be certain. The woman on the scree slope was not my sister. She had my sister's hair color, or something close to it. She had my sister's build, or something close to it. She had my sister's walk, more precisely than close to it. But her ear was not my sister's ear. My sister's ears had a small attached lobe, a family trait we shared with my mother. This woman's ear had a free lobe. It was a small thing. It was the thing I saw. The woman stepped into the trees and was gone. I stood at the clearing for another few minutes, then I sat back down on the bench. I drank some water. I did not cry. I noted, with the small clinical part of my mind that had been keeping notes since I was a child, that I did not cry. Then I got up and continued along the trail towards the lake. I do not know what I expected to find at the lake. I did not find anything. The lake was small and blue and shallow at its near edge, and I could see the bottom clearly for perhaps 20 feet out. There were 3 other people there when I arrived, a couple sitting on a log eating sandwiches, and a man in a sun hat with a camera on a tripod aimed at the far shore. I nodded to them. They nodded back. I sat on a flat rock near the shore, and I ate my sandwich and I drank my water, and I thought about the woman on the scree. She had not been my sister. I was certain of that. I had been certain of it in the moment once I saw the ear, and I was certain of it now. But she had been walking with my sister's walk, and she had been walking in a place my sister had come to and not left, and the birds had stopped for a section of trail in a way that had felt like a room I was passing through, and then the birds had started again in a way that had felt like a room I was leaving. I ate my sandwich slowly. The couple on the log finished theirs and began to pack up. The man with the tripod took a series of photographs of what appeared to be nothing in particular on the far shore, and then dismantled his camera with the small, practiced gestures of a person who did this often. He nodded to me again as he passed. He said, "Nice day." I said it was. When they were gone, I sat by the lake alone for perhaps 20 minutes. Nothing happened. The lake did not do anything. The forest around it did not do anything. It was a small alpine lake on a September afternoon in a national park, and it was quiet in the ordinary way that alpine lakes are quiet in September, and there was nothing about it that would have told a person who did not already know that anything had ever gone wrong in this place. I understood, sitting there, that this was probably the point. Whatever was wrong with the park was not wrong at the lake. It was wrong in the section of trail before the clearing, and possibly in the clearing itself, and possibly on the scree slope. It was not wrong here. I did not go looking for the woman on the scree. I want to be honest about that. I did not go down to the trees at the base of the slope to see whether she was still there. I did not call out to her from the clearing on my way back. I sat at the lake for 20 minutes, and then I stood up and started walking back down the trail. And when I passed the clearing again, I did not look at the ridge. I looked at the trail. I put one foot in front of the other. I passed through the quiet section of trail without stopping, and I noticed the birds resume, and I did not turn around. I did not go looking for her because I understood, by the time I reached the lake, that whatever the woman was, she was not something I could bring back with me. If I had gone down to the trees, one of two things would have happened. Either I would have found her, and she would have been someone, a hiker who resembled my sister, a member of a research team, a person whose presence in that spot had an explanation that would have made the morning ordinary, or I would not have found her, and I would have spent the rest of my life knowing that I had gone looking. Both outcomes would have been endings of a kind. Neither of them would have been the ending I needed. What I needed was to know that Wenna had walked through a place that was not quite the same as the rest of the park. I had that now. It was not enough to explain what had happened to her. It was not enough to justify anything. But it was more than I had come with, and it was as much as I could carry. I got back to the trailhead at 4:12 in the afternoon. I signed out on the trail register. There was one entry between my morning entry and my afternoon entry, a family of 4, listed with their 4 names, who had signed in at 11:30 and had not yet signed out. I noted their names as I turned the pages. I looked at the parking lot on my way to my car. The dusty station wagon was gone. The rental SUV was still there. The hatchback with the out-of-state college sticker was gone. There were 2 other cars I had not seen that morning. Presumably one of them belonged to the family. I drove back to the lodge. I did not drive fast. On the paved section I passed the same Park Service pickup, or one that looked like it, going the other way. The driver was a different man. He did not raise his finger from the wheel. He looked straight ahead. At the lodge I checked in with the desk clerk, who noted my return in a small book she kept beside her computer. She said, "You're back nice and early?" I said I was. She said, "How was the trail?" I said it had been a nice walk. She said, "Some of our guests find it a little quiet, but that's the beauty of the northeast side. Not too many people." I said yes. She smiled the small professional smile of a person concluding a routine interaction. I went up to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then I got up and I walked back down to the lobby, and I found Yvette in her office off the visitor center, and I stood in her doorway until she looked up. She said, "How was it?" I said, "I saw a woman on the scree slope below the clearing at the 3-mile point. She had my sister's walk. She was not my sister." Yvette looked at me for a long time. Her hand did not move to the edge of her desk. It stayed where it was, on top of a small pile of paperwork. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "The trail is quiet for about 100 yards, between roughly the 1.5-mile point and the 2-mile point. There are no birds in that section. The birds come back on either side of it." Yvette said, "Yes." I said, "Was my sister's disappearance filed as a wildlife incident?" Yvette's face did not change. She said, "I can't tell you that. I don't know. That was before my time. I don't have access to the older files." I said, "But it's the kind of thing that could have been filed that way." Yvette said, "I don't know what happened to your sister. I want to say that first. I don't know. Nobody I work with knows. There isn't a person here who has that information and is keeping it from you. That's not how this place operates." I said, "How does it operate?" Yvette looked down at her paperwork. She looked back up. She said, "There are places in this district where things happen that we don't have good words for. When they happen, the paperwork gets filled out in a way that is not exactly wrong. It is not exactly right either. It is the paperwork we have. The people who filled it out did not invent it. They inherited it. I inherited it. I don't like it. I don't defend it. I do the job." I said, "Do you tell people?" She said, "I tell people to be back by 10. I tell them a room check will happen. I tell them a little more, sometimes, if they seem to already know something." I told you a little more. I could tell that you already knew something, even if you didn't know that you did. I said, "Why don't you tell them everything?" She said, "Because I don't know everything, and because most of the people who come here are going to walk their trail and eat their sandwich and drive home and never notice anything and be fine. The number of people who are not going to be fine is very small. If I told everyone, most of what I told would be to people who did not need to hear it, and it would not help them, and it might frighten them out of a walk that was going to be a good walk. I have thought about this a great deal. This is where I have arrived." I said, "How long have you worked here?" She said, 14 years. I said, "How many people?" She said, "In 14 years. I said, "In 14 years. She said, 7 that I have direct knowledge of. Probably a few more that I don't. It is not many. In relation to the number of visitors we get, it is more than none." I stood in her doorway for a while after she said that. Yvette did not look away. She waited. She was, I understood, a person who had learned to wait through conversations like this one. She had probably had over 14 years, more of them than I would want to count. Finally I said, "The woman I saw, on the scree." Yvette said, "Yes." I said, "Was she real?" Yvette said, "I don't know. I've never seen her. Other people have described seeing people. Sometimes people they knew. Sometimes people they did not know. Nobody has ever gone down to look and come back and told me what they found. That is not evidence of anything. That is only what I know." I said, "If someone did go down to look?" Yvette said, "I would ask them not to. That is all I would do. I would not stop them. I would ask." I said, "You're asking me now." She said, "I don't need to ask you. You already didn't." I stayed at the lodge for the rest of the week. I did not go back to the Northeast Trail. I walked other trails, on other sides of the district, a lakeshore loop, a meadow walk, an easy climb to a fire lookout that had been decommissioned decades earlier and turned into a small museum. On those trails, the birds behaved ordinarily. The forests were ordinary forests. The other visitors were ordinary visitors. I ate dinner in the lodge dining room every night. On the 4th night, behaved ordinarily. The forests were ordinary forests. The other visitors were ordinary visitors. I ate dinner in the lodge dining room every night. On the 4th night, an older man sat down at the table next to mine and struck up a conversation about the weather. And I let him, and we talked for perhaps an hour, about nothing in particular. And when he got up to leave, he said, "You have a good rest of your trip, dear." And I said he should too. It was the longest conversation I had with anyone that week except Yvette. On my last morning, I drove home. The drive took 2 days. On the 2nd day, in a motel room in a small town whose name I no longer remember, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone, and I called the realtor who had been asking me for 6 months about the house. I told her I wanted to sell it. She said she was glad. She said she thought it was the right decision. She said she would send over the paperwork. I said, "I'll sign it when I get home." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." I hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then I got up, and I finished the drive. I have thought, in the months since, about what I owe the family of 4 whose names I saw in the trail register. I have thought about it more than I have thought about almost anything else. They were an ordinary family, with ordinary names, going for an ordinary walk on a September afternoon. They had signed in at 11:30. They had not, when I signed out at 4:12, signed out. That does not mean anything on its own 6.4 miles, is a slow walk with children. And I do not know whether they had children, and I do not know how fast they walked. It is very possible, and even likely, that they signed out safely at some point after I drove away. I have chosen to believe this. I have chosen it in the way a person chooses to believe a thing they cannot verify, because the alternative is unbearable, and the choice itself does not cost anyone anything. I did not call the park to ask. I did not write to Yvette. I did not go back. I understand that this is a form of not doing, and that not doing has its own weight. I have decided that I can carry it. I have decided this the way I decided about the house, not because I am certain it is right, but because I understood, sitting by the lake on a September afternoon, after I had seen a woman walk with my sister's walk on a scree slope below a clearing where a stranger had loved these woods, that certainty was not going to be available to me, and I had to make my decisions with what was available. I sold the house in the spring. I used some of the money to travel. I have walked in other places since. Some of them have been quiet in ways that reminded me of the Northeast Trail. Most of them have not. When I'm on a walk and I notice that the birds have stopped, I stop too, and I listen, and I decide whether I want to continue. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I turn around. I have not, since that week, seen any woman walking with any walk I recognized. I sometimes think about Yvette in her office, waiting for the next visitor who already knows something. I do not know how she does the job. I do not know how anyone does the job. I suspect that she does it the way most people do most jobs, imperfectly, with private compromises, in the belief that her small, honest gestures are better than nothing, without ever knowing whether they are enough. I hope they are enough. I hope the family of 4 signed out at 4:30 in the afternoon and drove back to the lodge and ate dinner and went home. I hope the woman on the scree slope was a hiker with a knee injury who had never heard of my sister and would be surprised to know that anyone had watched her cross a slope from a clearing 200 yards above her on a bright, cold morning in the second week of September. I hope this. What I know is smaller. What I know is that I went to the park to decide about a house, and while I was there, I understood something about my sister that I had not understood before, and the understanding was not that she had died in any of the ways I had imagined, and it was not that she had not died. The understanding was that there are places in the world where the paperwork does not know what to call what happens, and that the people who work in those places have decided, imperfectly, to keep the paperwork rather than the truth, because the paperwork is at least a thing that can be handed to the next person, and the truth cannot. I do not blame them. I might have made the same decision. I did make it, in a smaller way, at the base of a clearing, when I did not walk down to a stand of trees to find out who the woman was. I sold the house. I am not going back to the park. That is what I did. That is the end of it. For me.